The courtroom was silent, thick with tension. Judge Marcus Grant, a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark brown skin and sharp eyes that missed nothing, sat high on his bench, staring down at the defendant. His gavel rested lightly in his hand, though the grip around it had tightened just slightly. Across from him, the defendant, a man in his mid-40s with messy blonde hair and an arrogance that dripped from every movement, leaned back in his chair, smirking. He had just said something that made the air itself feel heavy. "Man, you should be a comedian," the defendant chuckled, shaking his head. "I mean, really. You're sitting up there, acting like you actually matter. It's funny." The room froze. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a wave. Even the court officers shifted uncomfortably. The defendant's lawyer, a thin man in a cheap gray suit, paled, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. Judge Grant exhaled through his nose. He didn't move for a long moment. The only sound was the quiet ticking of the courtroom clock. Then, finally, he set his gavel down. What he did next was alarming. 3 weeks earlier, the same courtroom had been much calmer. The trial had only just begun, and the case was already attracting attention. The defendant, Richard Hargrove, had been charged with fraud, millions of dollars stolen, businesses destroyed, lives ruined. Yet, despite the evidence stacked against him, Richard remained confident, almost too confident, like he knew something no one else did. Judge Grant had seen men like Richard before. He had presided over countless cases involving wealthy men who believed their money and influence could get them out of anything. Usually, they were right, but not in his courtroom. From the first day of the trial, Richard's attitude was clear. He didn't respect the process, and he certainly didn't respect Judge Grant. He interrupted testimonies with scoffs, whispered jokes to his lawyer while victims spoke, and wore a permanent smirk as if the trial was an inconvenience rather than a fight for justice. At first, Judge Grant gave warnings. "Mr. Hargrove, this is a court of law, not a stage for your commentary. If you cannot conduct yourself with respect, I will hold you in contempt." Richard always responded the same way, a slow, lazy nod, as if he were agreeing to humor a child. The prosecution presented its case, showing clear evidence that Richard had embezzled millions. His company had funneled funds through fake charities, and he had spent the stolen money on luxury vacations, cars, and private jets. The victims, small business owners, and struggling families, sat in the courtroom, watching him with a mix of anger and desperation. But Richard? He never looked their way. Then came the moment where everything changed. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the air in the courtroom was heavy with anticipation. The prosecution had just called their final witness, a former employee of Richard's who had been tricked into signing fraudulent documents. The witness, a young woman named Sarah Dillard, had tears in her eyes as she described how her life had been ruined. When she finished, the courtroom was quiet. Everyone was waiting to see Richard's reaction. He yawned, loudly. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he leaned forward and looked directly at Judge Grant. "Your Honor, can we wrap this up? I have better things to do than sit here listening to sob stories." The courtroom erupted. People shouted in outrage. The prosecution demanded he be reprimanded, and even Richard's own lawyer seemed unsure of how to proceed. Judge Grant didn't raise his voice. He simply fixed Richard with a long, steady look. "Mr. Hargrove," he said, voice calm but sharp, "you may have better things to do, but I assure you, none of them will matter if you continue to test this court's patience." Richard only smirked. And then came the final moment, the moment that led to where we started. It was sentencing day. The jury had returned their verdict, guilty. The courtroom was packed, reporters filled the aisles, cameras flashed. Judge Grant sat high above, prepared to deliver his sentence. Richard stood before him, still smirking, still arrogant, as if none of this was real. And then he spoke. "Man, you should be a comedian," Richard said with a chuckle. "I mean, really. You're sitting up there, acting like you actually matter. It's funny." The room held its breath. And then, Judge Grant moved. He didn't pick up his gavel. He didn't call for order. Instead, he did something that made everyone in the courtroom go completely silent. What he did next was alarming. Judge Marcus Grant slowly leaned forward, placing both hands on his bench. His dark eyes locked onto Richard Hargrove's, his face unreadable. The courtroom was frozen in time, every person inside waiting for what would happen next. Then, in a voice so low and cold that it sent a chill through the room, Judge Grant said, Bailiff, lock the doors. A murmur of confusion spread through the crowd. The bailiffs hesitated for a second before obeying, securing the doors with a heavy clank. Richard's smirk wavered. Just a little. Judge Grant's voice remained calm, but there was something in it, something dangerous. Mr. Hargrove, do you think this is a joke? That this courtroom, this trial, this sentence is all just a performance for your entertainment? Richard chuckled nervously. I mean, yeah, I've seen better shows on Netflix. Judge Grant nodded slowly. I see. Well, let's give you a performance you won't forget. Then, to everyone's shock, he stood up from his seat. He walked down from the bench, stepping into the well of the courtroom, approaching Richard. The audience gasped, and even the court officers looked uncertain. Judges didn't do this. Judges never did this. But Judge Grant wasn't just any judge. He stopped just a few feet from Richard, staring at him, unblinking. The tension in the room was unbearable. Then, in a chillingly calm voice, he said, I sentence you to 20 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. The room exploded. Gasps. Cries. Reporters scrambling to write down what had just happened. Richard's smirk was gone. His face drained of color. What? You can't. Judge Grant didn't flinch. And that's not all. The courtroom fell silent again. Judge Grant turned to the bailiffs. Take him now. 2 officers grabbed Richard by the arms, but he started struggling. Wait. You can't do this. I'll appeal. I have lawyers. Judge Grant's lips barely moved. Your lawyers are useless now. The entire courtroom was stunned. This was not how sentencing normally went. But no one dared to speak. The bailiffs pulled Richard toward the exit. He was shouting now, eyes wild with disbelief. This is illegal. This isn't how the system works. I have rights. Judge Grant didn't even look at him as he said, No, Mr. Hargrove. Your rights ended the moment you disrespected this courtroom. The doors swung open. Richard's screams echoed as he was dragged away. The room was left in stunned silence. Then, as if nothing had happened, Judge Grant turned back toward the courtroom. He calmly walked back up to his bench, adjusted his robe, and picked up his gavel. He surveyed the room, his expression blank. This court is adjourned. And then, he slammed the gavel down. A week earlier, things had been much different. Back then, Richard Hargrove had still been confident, still arrogant. He had sat in the courtroom every day, barely paying attention as the evidence against him mounted. His lawyer, a nervous wreck of a man named Victor Langley, had tried his best, but even he knew the case was hopeless. The fraud was undeniable. The stolen money was gone. The jury had already made up their minds. But Richard didn't care. I'm not going to prison, he had told Victor one evening after court. They had been in a small conference room, away from the cameras. Do you know who I am? The people I know? This judge, this Grant guy, he's nothing. I'll walk out of this just like I've walked out of everything else. Victor had swallowed hard. Sir, the jury. Richard had waved him off. Juries are sheep. Judges? Even worse. I'll make them dance. He had believed it. For years, Richard Hargrove had used money and power to slip out of trouble. He had bribed officials, paid off witnesses, and destroyed lives without consequence. He had no reason to believe this time would be any different. And then came the trial's final week. Judge Grant had watched Richard carefully throughout the proceedings. He had noted every smirk, every scoff, every whispered joke. He had seen men like Richard before. But Richard had never seen a man like Judge Grant. So when Richard had finally opened his mouth to call the judge a funny comedian, he had unknowingly signed his own fate. Because Judge Marcus Grant wasn't a man to be laughed at. And now, as Richard sat in a holding cell, reality sinking in, he realized, too late, that this was a game he never should have played. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. Something far worse was coming. And when it did, Richard would wish he had never spoken those words. Richard Hargrove sat in the cold, dimly lit holding cell, his hands gripping the edges of the metal bench beneath him. The reality of what had just happened was starting to settle in, and for the first time in his life, he felt something he hadn't felt before. Fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent his life evading consequences, laughing in the face of the law, bribing his way out of trouble. Judges were nothing more than old men in robes, easily swayed by money and influence. But Judge Grant, that man had just destroyed him. Richard clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He would appeal. He had high-powered lawyers on his payroll, people who could twist the law in his favor. This wasn't over. Or so he thought. A heavy door creaked open, and Richard lifted his head. A guard stepped inside, his face blank and unreadable. "Let's go," the guard muttered. Richard frowned. "Go where?" The guard didn't answer. He just stepped aside, waiting. Richard hesitated before standing. His legs felt weak, but he masked it with an air of arrogance, straightening his suit jacket. "I assume I'm being moved to a more suitable facility? You know, one for people with money." The guard didn't even blink. "Move." Richard scowled but obeyed. The walk through the narrow corridors of the courthouse jail was eerily silent. The air smelled like damp concrete and sweat. Richard expected to be led to a police transport, but instead, they stopped in front of a door he didn't recognize. The guard swiped a keycard, and the heavy door clicked open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room with a single wooden chair in the center. The walls were plain, gray, lifeless. And then he saw him. Judge Marcus Grant stood in the shadows of the room, his hands folded behind his back. Richard's stomach twisted. "What the hell is this?" Richard demanded. "This isn't protocol." The judge stepped forward, the door shutting behind him. "Sit down, Mr. Hargrove," Judge Grant said, his voice dangerously calm. Richard scoffed. "I don't take orders from you outside that courtroom. You've already made your little dramatic statement, so what now? You brought me here to scare me." Judge Grant didn't move. He simply stared. For the first time in Richard's life, he felt small. "You've spent your life stepping on people." Judge Grant finally spoke. "Lying, cheating, stealing. And every time, you've gotten away with it." Richard smirked. "Yeah? And what's your point?" "It's called winning, Judge." Judge Grant's expression didn't change. He took a slow step forward. "Tell me, Mr. Hargrove, do you believe in justice?" Richard narrowed his eyes. "I believe in money. And money wins. Always." Judge Grant nodded, as if expecting that answer. He then reached into his pocket and pulled something out. A small, black object. A tape recorder. Richard's smirk faded slightly. "You see," Judge Grant said, pressing play. "I wanted to remind you of your own words." A crackling noise filled the room, and then Richard's own voice. "Judges are nothing. I'll make them dance." Richard stiffened. Then, another recording. "Juries are sheep. They don't matter." His own words echoed back at him like a ghost whispering in his ear. His mouth went dry. "Where the hell did you get that?" Judge Grant didn't answer. He simply stopped the tape and tucked it back into his pocket. "It's amazing how careless men like you are. You talk too much, Mr. Hargrove." Richard's mind raced. Who had recorded him? Was it his lawyer? A hidden wire? How much did Grant really know? "You can appeal," Judge Grant continued, taking another slow step forward. "You can throw your money around. But this case is airtight. Your lawyers can't erase this. No amount of money can undo what's already been done." Richard swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. But then, he forced himself to smirk again. "That was cute, Judge," Richard said, shaking his head. "Really? But let's be real. You want something from me, don't you? Why else bring me in here?" Judge Grant tilted his head slightly. "What do you think I want, Mr. Hargrove?" Richard leaned forward, confidence creeping back into his voice. "Let's cut the act. You think you're better than me? You're not. You just wear a robe and sit on a high chair. But me? I built empires. You put people away, but I own people." Judge Grant remained silent. "So," Richard continued, "what is it? You want a deal? A favor? Or maybe," he grinned, "maybe you want money? I could double your salary in a day, Judge. Just name the price." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, Judge Grant did something Richard did not expect. He laughed. Not a loud laugh. Not a forced chuckle. A slow, deep laugh that sent a shiver down Richard's spine. And then, Judge Grant leaned in close. Close enough that Richard could see the cold fire in his eyes. "You still don't get it," Judge Grant whispered. "I don't want anything from you, Mr. Hargrove." Richard blinked. Then, Judge Grant's voice dropped even lower. "I just want to watch you burn." The words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, his throat tightening. For the first time, he realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a legal battle. This wasn't just a judge handing down a sentence. This was personal. And Judge Grant wasn't just another man in a robe. He was something far worse. Richard's heart pounded as the judge straightened his back, gave him one last look, and turned toward the door. Just before stepping out, Judge Grant paused and glanced over his shoulder. "Oh, and Mr. Hargrove, Richard barely managed to look up. "Enjoy your stay," Judge Grant said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Because the real punishment hasn't even begun yet." The door slammed shut, and Richard Hargrove? For the first time in his life, he truly felt trapped. But the worst part? He had no idea what was coming next. Richard Hargrove sat frozen in the chair, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The heavy steel door Judge Grant had walked through remained shut, sealing him inside the dimly lit room. The judge's last words echoed in his head. The real punishment hasn't even begun yet. A cold sweat dripped down his spine. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This wasn't how his life was supposed to turn out. He was Richard Hargrove. He had built companies, manipulated markets, ruined people without consequence. He had politicians on speed dial, CEOs who owed him favors. And yet, none of that mattered now. Judge Grant wasn't just sentencing him. He was destroying him. A sharp knock on the door made Richard jolt. The door swung open, and a different guard stepped inside. He was taller than the first, his uniform pressed perfectly, his expression unreadable. "On your feet." Richard hesitated. "Where are we going?" The guard gave no answer. He simply motioned for Richard to move. Swallowing down his rising panic, Richard pushed himself up from the chair and followed the guard out. The dimly lit hallway stretched before them, cold and empty. His mind screamed at him to say something, to bargain, to fight. But for the first time in his life, he had nothing. The transport van was not what he expected. Richard had seen movies, had watched as high-profile criminals were escorted to their cushy, minimum security prisons in clean vehicles with air conditioning. This was not that. The van was dark inside, the windows reinforced with thick metal bars. The seats were cold, hard, and bolted to the floor. The only other people inside were two guards, their faces unreadable, their weapons resting on their belts. As the van rumbled to life, Richard shifted uncomfortably. "All right," he muttered, trying to regain his usual confidence. "Where the hell are we going?" Neither guard answered. Richard clenched his fists. "I asked you a question. I have a right to know." Still silence. The van turned onto the road, the hum of the engine the only sound in the cramped space. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then two. Richard's fingers twitched. "Where are you taking me?" he demanded again, louder this time. The guards remained silent. And then, he noticed something. They weren't heading toward any of the expected prison routes. No federal facility was in this direction. This was wrong. This was very wrong. A creeping dread settled into his chest. He had been in control of his life for so long that the feeling of powerlessness was alien, suffocating. And then, finally, one of the guards spoke. "Welcome to real justice, Hargrove." Richard's stomach dropped. The van came to a sudden stop. Before he could react, the doors were yanked open, and hands grabbed him, hauling him out into the cold night air. Richard stumbled as they dragged him forward. He looked up, expecting a prison entrance, maybe a courthouse. Instead, darkness. They were in the middle of nowhere. A long, cracked road stretched behind them, disappearing into the distance. No streetlights, no buildings, no sign of civilization, just trees. And then, just ahead, a building. It was old, towering, surrounded by high, rusted fences. It looked nothing like any prison he had ever seen. This wasn't a prison. This was something else. Richard turned to the guards, panic rising in his throat. "Where the hell are we?" No answer. A massive metal gate groaned open, and Richard was shoved inside. The gate slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang. And then, for the first time, he saw the other prisoners. Or at least, he thought they were prisoners. They stood silently in the courtyard, their faces blank, their eyes dark and hollow. They didn't move like normal inmates. They barely moved at all. Richard's breath hitched. No, 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 this isn't right. I was supposed to go to federal prison. Not, he gestured wildly. Not here. The guards ignored him. One of them yanked open a heavy door leading into the building and shoved him inside. The air inside was wrong. It smelled of damp stone, metal, something else, something he couldn't place. The walls were old, crumbling in places, covered in long, dark stains. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Slow, deliberate. A figure stepped forward. It wasn't a prison warden. It wasn't a guard. It was Judge Grant. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Judge Grant stood tall, his expression as calm as ever. But his eyes, there was something in them. Something cold. Richard's voice wavered. What is this? Judge Grant stepped forward, the dim overhead light casting deep shadows across his face. This, Mr. Hargrove, he said quietly, is where men like you belong. Richard's hands trembled. This isn't a real prison, he hissed. This is illegal. You are breaking the law. Judge Grant smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a man who had planned everything. Oh, Mr. Hargrove, Judge Grant said smoothly. You spent your life bending the law to your will. His smile faded. Now, the law bends for me. Richard's mouth went dry. You can't do this. Judge Grant tilted his head slightly. And yet, you're here. The judge turned to the guards. Take him to his cell. Richard fought. He twisted. He shouted. He cursed. But the guards were too strong. They dragged him down the long, dark hallway, past rows of heavy steel doors. Behind them, whispers echoed. He caught glimpses of pale hands reaching through the bars, dark eyes watching him. The cell door swung open. And then he was thrown inside. The door slammed shut. Richard stumbled forward, catching himself against the damp stone wall. His chest rose and fell in sharp, panicked breaths. He turned, rushing to the bars. Hey, let me out of here. Silence. Then, footsteps. Judge Grant appeared on the other side of the bars. He regarded Richard for a long moment, as if studying him. Then, with quiet amusement, he said, Now, let's see how funny you are without your money. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Richard Hargrove was trapped, and he had no idea what was coming next. Richard Hargrove sat on the cold, damp floor of his cell, his back pressed against the rough stone wall. His breaths were uneven, his mind a whirlwind of panic and confusion. This wasn't a prison. It wasn't a detention center. This was something else. The hallway outside his cell was silent. Too silent. In a real prison, he'd hear voices, guards shouting, inmates talking, maybe even distant fights breaking out. But here, there was nothing. Just the soft hum of dim, flickering lights overhead. And the whispers. Every now and then, he swore he could hear them. Low murmurs from the cells around him. But whenever he strained to listen, the voices faded. His fingers twitched. He had spent his entire life in control. Controlling people, controlling companies, controlling the law itself. But now, in this dark place, he felt something he never had before. Powerless. Suddenly, a sharp click echoed through the hall. Richard snapped his head up just in time to see his cell door slowly creak open. His heart pounded. Was this a mistake? A chance to escape? He hesitated for only a second before pushing himself up and stepping cautiously toward the door. He peeked into the hallway, empty. Every instinct screamed at him to run. He stepped out, his shoes barely making a sound against the concrete floor. The dim lights above flickered, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Something about this place felt wrong. He took a few steps, passing by another cell. A figure stood inside. Richard froze. The inmate, if that's what he was, stood completely still, his face partially hidden in the darkness. His hands gripped the bars, knuckles pale and tight. Richard swallowed. Hey, do you know what this place is? The figure didn't answer. His breathing was slow. Too slow. Then, suddenly, the inmate moved. Not like a normal person. Not like someone shifting their weight or adjusting their posture. It was unnatural, like a glitch in reality, his body shifting too quickly, too smoothly, without sound. Richard stumbled back. His heart slammed against his ribs. And then the whisper came. You shouldn't be here. Richard bolted. His feet pounded against the floor as he ran, twisting down the corridor, searching for an exit, any exit. His breaths came in ragged gasps. The hall stretched endlessly, every turn leading to another identical corridor. No signs. No doors leading outside. This place was a maze. Then he saw it. A staircase at the end of the hallway. A heavy metal door at the top. Richard pushed himself harder, nearly tripping over his own feet as he raced toward it. He reached the stairs, took them two at a time, and slammed his palms against the door. Locked. No. He jiggled the handle violently, his pulse pounding in his ears. Then, behind him, a voice. Calm. Unshaken. You're running in circles, Mr. Hargrove. Richard spun around, his back pressed against the door. Judge Grant stood at the bottom of the stairs, perfectly composed, hands in his pockets, like he had been expecting this. Richard's mouth went dry. What the hell is this place? He demanded. Judge Grant exhaled. almost like he was disappointed. You still don't get it. Richard's fists clenched. I have rights. This isn't a real prison. You can't just. Judge Grant took a slow step forward. Richard pressed harder against the door. I told you, Grant said quietly. This isn't about the law. This isn't about justice in the way you understand it. He tilted his head slightly. This is about balance. Richard's chest heaved. Balance. Judge Grant's expression darkened. For years, you have taken. You've stolen from the helpless, crushed small businesses, ruined families. And every time, you walked away untouched. His voice lowered. You laughed in the face of justice. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. Judge Grant climbed the first step, then another. Slowly, deliberately. Men like you don't belong in regular prisons, he continued. No, Mr. Hargrove. You belong here. Richard's body felt numb. What is this place? He whispered. Judge Grant smiled. A place for the forgotten. Richard's stomach twisted. You mean? I mean, Grant interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper. You don't exist anymore. Richard's blood ran cold. You'll never be transferred, Judge Grant continued. No appeals. No visits. No records. You've been erased. Richard's breath came in quick, shallow gasps. No, that's impossible. That's illegal. My lawyers. Grant's voice remained eerily calm. Your lawyers won't find you. No one will. Richard's mind reeled. This couldn't be real. This was a bluff. It had to be. Then, Judge Grant reached into his pocket and pulled something out. A small, silver coin. Richard frowned. What? Grant held it up between his fingers. The dim light glinted off its smooth surface. And then, he flipped it. The coin spun in the air. And when it landed back in Judge Grant's palm, the lights in the hallway went out. The air turned ice cold. The whispers returned. But this time, they were louder. Richard's breath hitched. Something moved in the darkness. Not a person. Something else. Something waiting. Richard's legs trembled. No. Judge Grant's voice was barely a whisper. Welcome to your sentence, Mr. Hargrove. Then, Richard felt it. A presence. Right behind him. Cold breath against his neck. A long, shadowed hand, reaching. And then, the lights flickered back on. Judge Grant was gone. The whispers faded. But Richard wasn't alone. He turned, slowly, dreading what he would see. And there, standing just outside his cell, was something that wasn't human. And it was smiling. Richard's breath hitched. His entire body went rigid as his eyes locked onto the figure outside his cell. It was wrong. The thing standing there had the shape of a man, but something about it was off. Its limbs were too long, its head slightly tilted, its shadow stretching unnaturally under the dim light. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and its eyes, black, endless pits, stared at him with something Richard could only describe as hunger. And then, it smiled. Not like a normal person. Its lips pulled back too far, revealing rows of teeth that were jagged, uneven, like they had been broken and put back together the wrong way. Richard stumbled back, his legs hitting the cold metal cot in his cell. No, this isn't real. The thing outside his cell didn't blink, didn't move. Then, it twitched. Its body jerked in quick, unnatural spasms, like a puppet with its strings yanked too hard. Its mouth stretched wider. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. He gripped the sides of his head, squeezing his eyes shut. This isn't real, he whispered. This isn't real. The air in the room shifted. The whispering returned. But this time, it was inside the cell. Richard's eyes snapped open. The figure was gone. But the whisper remained. It came from the corners of the cell, from the walls, from behind him. Richard. His breath caught in his throat. He turned, slowly. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker now. Deeper. Something moved within them. Something crawled. Richard felt ice grip his spine. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't a prison. This was something else entirely. And he was trapped inside it. The next time Richard woke up, he wasn't sure how much time had passed. The cell had no windows, no clocks. There was no way to tell night from day. He had fallen asleep on the cold, hard cot, his body exhausted from the sheer terror of the night before. For a brief moment, he thought maybe, just maybe, it had been a dream. Then he heard it. A soft scratching sound. It came from the other side of the cell door. Richard sat up slowly, his breath shallow. He didn't want to look, but he had to. He turned his head and froze. There was a hand pressed against the bars. Not a human hand. The fingers were too long. The skin was gray and cracked. The nails were sharp, jagged, curving like claws. And then, the fingers twitched. Richard's entire body tensed. He forced himself to move, scrambling backward until his back hit the wall. His mind screamed at him to say something, to call for help. But there was no help. No guards. No other inmates. Just him. And it. The hand slowly slid down the bars. The nails scraped against the metal, making a horrible screeching sound. Then, the thing outside the cell laughed. Not a human laugh. A distorted, broken sound. Like something trying to imitate laughter, but failing. Richard clamped his hands over his ears. Go away. Go away. And just like that, it stopped. The laughter. The scratching. The breathing. Silence. Richard slowly lowered his hands. The hand was gone. The hallway outside his cell was empty again. But he knew. He knew. It was still watching. Waiting. Hours passed. Maybe days. Time didn't exist here. No food came. No guards checked on him. The lights flickered on and off at random intervals, plunging him into darkness without warning. The whispers never stopped. He heard them even when he covered his ears. Richard, do you think they'll find you? No one remembers you. No one cares. His sanity began to crack. He spent hours, maybe longer, banging on the bars, screaming for anyone to let him out. His throat grew raw, his hands bruised. But no one came. He was alone. Or at least, he thought he was. Then, the door at the end of the hallway creaked open. Richard's breath caught. Footsteps echoed through the corridor. Slow, deliberate. And then, Judge Grant stepped into view. His expression was the same. Calm, unshaken. Like he hadn't just left Richard to rot in a place that wasn't even real. Richard lunged at the bars. Let me out of here. Judge Grant simply watched him. Are you enjoying your stay? Richard's hands trembled with rage. You can't do this. This is illegal. It's inhumane. You're breaking the law. Judge Grant tilted his head. The law. He let out a soft chuckle. Mr. Hargrove, do you still think the law applies to you? Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. Judge Grant took a step closer. How many people did you destroy, Richard? How many families lost everything while you sat in your penthouse, drinking your expensive whiskey, laughing at them? Richard's jaw clenched. That was business. Judge Grant's expression darkened. No, Mr. Hargrove. That was theft. That was greed. That was a sickness. His voice lowered. And now, it's your turn to suffer. Richard's entire body went cold. Judge Grant turned slightly, glancing down the hallway. Would you like to know where you really are? He asked. Richard didn't answer. Judge Grant's voice dropped to a whisper. This is where they send the ones the system can't save. Richard's stomach twisted. The liars. The thieves. The untouchable ones, Grant continued. The ones who buy their way out of justice. He turned back to Richard, his eyes dark. But there is no way out of this place. Richard's breathing became ragged. You can't do this. Judge Grant smiled. I already did. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the silver coin. Richard's heart stopped. No. Judge Grant flipped the coin. It spun through the air, and the lights went out. The whispers returned. Only this time. They were inside the cell with him. The whispers slithered around Richard like invisible tendrils, wrapping tightly around his mind. Richard, Richard, Richard. They were closer now. The darkness wasn't just a lack of light. It was alive. It moved. It pressed against him, breathing, shifting. Then, a hand brushed his shoulder. Richard screamed. He twisted away, stumbling back until his spine hit the cold stone wall. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. He couldn't see. He could only feel. And then, the whispering stopped. Silence. But the darkness remained. Then, from somewhere unseen, a click. The lights flickered back on. Richard's heart pounded in his chest. He frantically scanned the room, expecting to see it. But his cell was empty. The hallway outside was empty. Judge Grant was gone. But something was wrong. The air was different. Thicker. Heavier. Like something had been left behind. Richard swallowed hard. He ran his hands through his sweat-damp hair, trying to ground himself. I'm losing my mind. He had to get out of here. Now. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Or maybe days. There was no way to tell time in this place. No food came. No guards. No routine. Only silence. Only whispers. Richard sat curled in the corner of his cell, his mind fraying at the edges. He had been in tight situations before, boardroom battles, high-stakes lawsuits, financial disasters, but nothing like this. This wasn't a game he could win. He had no money, no influence, no power. He was nothing here. And then, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Richard's head snapped up. His muscles tensed. Someone was coming. He scrambled to his feet, his pulse hammering against his ribs. And then, a figure appeared. But it wasn't Judge Grant. It was an inmate. Or at least, what used to be an inmate. The man stood just outside Richard's cell, gripping the bars. His skin was pale, stretched too tightly over his bones. His eyes, black and sunken, locked onto Richard's with a hollow stare. Richard backed up instinctively. Who the hell are you?" he demanded. The man didn't answer. He just smiled. And then, he started laughing. Not a normal laugh. Not even an insane laugh. It was wrong. Distorted. Like his voice was being pulled apart. Richard clamped his hands over his ears. "Stop. Stop it." But the laughter didn't stop. It only grew louder. Then, without warning, the man lunged. His hands shot through the bars, reaching for Richard with unnatural speed. Richard barely had time to react. He threw himself backward, colliding with the cold stone wall. The man's fingers scraped the air just inches from Richard's face. And then, just as suddenly as it began, he stopped. His hands twitched. His head tilted. His laughter cut off. And then, he whispered, "You're already one of us." Richard's blood froze. His body locked up. The inmate's lips curled into a slow, knowing grin. Then, the lights flickered, and he was gone. Richard sucked in sharp, ragged breaths. His entire body trembled. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He pressed his palms against his temples, shutting his eyes. Think, Richard, think. He had to get out. He had to find a way. Then, from outside his cell, a voice. Calm. Smooth. "Judge Grant. Are you ready to listen now, Mr. Hargrove?" Richard's eyes snapped open. Judge Grant stood just outside the cell, perfectly calm, like he hadn't just let a monster roam these halls. Richard's chest heaved. What the hell is this place? Judge Grant exhaled slowly, as if Richard had asked a stupid question. "I told you," he said. "This is where men like you belong." Richard shook his head violently. No, I don't belong here. I don't deserve this." Judge Grant took a step closer. "Don't you?" Richard's breath caught. "This place doesn't just hold criminals," Judge Grant continued. "It holds predators, liars, thieves, people who built their lives on the suffering of others." His voice dropped lower. "You think you were sent here by accident?" Richard's heart pounded. Judge Grant smiled slightly. "You weren't sent here, Mr. Hargrove." His eyes darkened. "You were chosen." Richard's stomach twisted. "No. You spent years avoiding consequences," Grant continued. "Now, you get to experience them." Richard's hands curled into fists. "You can't do this." Judge Grant chuckled. "Oh, Richard." His voice was almost gentle now. "I already have." He reached into his pocket. Richard's throat tightened. "Not the coin. Please, not the coin." Judge Grant pulled it out, held it up between his fingers, and flipped it. The coin spun, and when it landed back in Grant's palm, the world around Richard changed. The walls melted. The cell bars twisted, stretching like shadows, shifting into something not human. And then, Richard wasn't in his cell anymore. The stone walls were gone. The prison bars, gone. He stood in blackness. Endless. Silent. And then, he heard them. The whispers. Not just one. Hundreds. Thousands. "Richard Hargrove. Time to pay your debt." The darkness moved. And then, they came for him. Richard stumbled backward, his hands grasping at nothing as the darkness moved. It wasn't just shadows. It wasn't just emptiness. It was alive. Figures began emerging from the black void. Dozens, then hundreds. Their faces were twisted, hollow, wrong. Some looked almost human, others didn't. Their eyes were black voids, their mouths stretching into silent screams. And they were all coming for him. No. Get away from me," Richard bellowed, but his voice barely echoed in this endless abyss. The whispers swarmed him. "You stole from us. You ruined us. Now we take from you." A hand shot out from the dark, grabbing his wrist. Richard thrashed violently, yanking away, but another hand clamped onto his shoulder. Then another, and another. They were pulling him down. His feet sank into the blackness as if it were liquid. He kicked. He screamed. He clawed at the air, but the more he struggled, the deeper he sank. The figures loomed over him, their faces flickering in and out of focus, their voices merging into a chorus of vengeance. Then, a new voice cut through the chaos. Calm. Controlled. Judge Grant. Now, he murmured. Let's not be too hasty. The figures froze. The hands gripping Richard loosened. The darkness stopped pulling him under. For a moment, Richard could breathe. His chest heaved. He turned his head, and there he was. Judge Grant stood a few feet away, his hands folded behind his back, watching, completely untouched by the horrors surrounding them. His eyes flicked down at Richard. You've had it easy your entire life, haven't you? Richard gasped for breath. Get me out of here. Judge Grant took a slow step forward. Do you finally understand what's happening? He asked. Richard's hands trembled. His legs were still trapped in the shadowy abyss. But for now, the creatures had stopped. Waiting. Judge Grant crouched slightly, lowering himself to Richard's level. There is no out, Richard, he said quietly. Richard's throat felt dry. What do you want? Judge Grant smirked slightly. It's not about what I want. It's about what they want. He gestured toward the creatures surrounding them. Richard's stomach twisted. These, Judge Grant continued, are the lives you've destroyed. Richard's breath hitched. That's not possible. Judge Grant raised an eyebrow. Isn't it? Richard's eyes darted around. The faces. Some were familiar. A man whose business he had crushed in a fraudulent buyout. A woman whose charity he had embezzled money from. A young employee he had fired after using him as a scapegoat. They were all here. And now, they had come for him. Judge Grant straightened his posture. I could let them take you. Richard's blood turned to ice. I could let them tear you apart, piece by piece, Grant continued. The whispers grew louder again, eager, hungry. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came out. Judge Grant sighed. But, he tilted his head slightly. I'm feeling generous. The whispers paused. The shadows stirred. Richard's heart pounded. You have a choice, Mr. Hargrove. Richard swallowed hard. A choice. Judge Grant nodded. You can stay here. With them. His voice was steady, unwavering. Let them take their revenge. Let them make you feel every ounce of suffering you caused. Richard shuddered. The hands around him tightened slightly, eager to pull him under again. Or, Judge Grant's voice dropped lower. I can give you a way out. Richard's breathing was uneven. His fingers dug into his arms. What do I have to do? Judge Grant smiled slightly. You took everything from these people. Now you give it back. Richard blinked. What? I'm offering you a deal. Grant's expression darkened. You sign away everything. Your money. Your assets. Every dollar you stole. Every luxury you ever had. He gestured to the figures looming behind him. You return it all to the people you destroyed. Richard's stomach twisted. But, Judge Grant continued, that's not all. Richard's jaw clenched. What else? Grant's smile faded. You disappear. Richard's pulse stuttered. You erase yourself, Grant explained. No more name. No more identity. No more power. He tilted his head. You walk out of here a nobody. Richard's hands balled into fists. That's insane. You can't expect me to. Judge Grant's eyes darkened. The shadows surged forward. The creatures lunged, their fingers curling around Richard's arms, his legs, his throat. He choked. The abyss pulled him down again. Cold. Suffocating. Stop. Stop. Richard gasped. The shadows hesitated. Judge Grant exhaled. I think you misunderstand the situation, Mr. Hargrove. Richard coughed violently, his lungs burning. This isn't a negotiation, Grant said smoothly. It's an offer. He took a slow step closer. And I suggest you take it. Richard clenched his teeth. His entire body trembled. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Lose everything. His money? His life? His name? He had spent years building his empire. His wealth, his power, it was who he was. But, he looked back at the shadows. The faces. The clawing hands. The endless black abyss waiting to swallow him whole. His choice was clear. Richard closed his eyes. His breath shook. And then, I'll do it. The darkness stilled. Judge Grant's expression remained unreadable. I didn't hear you. Richard forced himself to meet his gaze. His pride burned. His body ached. I'll do it, he whispered. I'll sign everything away. The whispers stopped. The abyss pulled back. The hands released him. Judge Grant nodded. Good. He reached into his coat and pulled out a single piece of paper. A contract. And a pen. Richard stared at it, his breathing still ragged. It was real. Everything would be gone. His fortune, his power, his existence. Judge Grant held the paper out. Sign. Richard hesitated. Then, with shaking hands, he took the pen and signed his name. The moment the ink touched the paper, the darkness shattered. The whispers vanished. The abyss collapsed. And then, Richard Hargrove woke up, lying on the cold steps of a courthouse. His name erased, his fortune gone, and the world? It had already forgotten him. Richard Hargrove blinked. His vision blurred at first, the harsh light of the early morning sun making his eyes sting. His body felt heavy, drenched in sweat, stiff, and utterly disoriented. The familiar scent of polished wood, the echoes of muted voices, the distant hum of traffic outside, everything about the world around him felt strangely out of place. He lifted his head, his hand pressing against the cold stone steps beneath him. His fingers trembled as he looked around. The courthouse. It was real, but something about it was different. He was different. For a moment, he tried to push himself up, but the effort was too much. His legs gave out, and he collapsed back onto the cold, unforgiving pavement. Where had he been? What had happened to him? The last thing he remembered was the contract, the shadows, Judge Grant's cold eyes. Everything seemed to collide in his mind. The whispers, the agony, the decision. And then, nothing. Had he signed it? The question hung in the air like a cloud he couldn't shake. Had he truly erased himself from existence? Had he really given up everything? He tried to focus. Focus, Richard. He pressed his palms into the pavement, using the stone to push himself upright. His body protested, his muscles aching with the unfamiliar strain. He was weak, tired, drained. But he stood, shakily, for the first time. The world around him felt distant, fuzzy. He took a deep breath and scanned his surroundings. The courthouse steps, the cold breeze. The world felt right, yet wrong. His thoughts swirled. Did they forget me? No. It's impossible. Richard gripped his head, trying to piece together the chaos. The cold grip of terror clawed at his chest, but there was something else, a strange emptiness. A void that hadn't been there before. He took a step forward, almost stumbling, and that's when he saw it. A man in a suit, standing just outside the courthouse doors, watching him. Richard froze. His stomach dropped. The man's eyes were cold. Too cold. The figure was familiar. The way he stood, too straight, too rigid. The expression on his face was neutral, but something about the gaze was unsettling. The man didn't move. Richard's heart raced. His legs wobbled. No, Richard whispered. This wasn't possible. The man stepped forward slowly, his black shoes clicking against the stone steps, and Richard's body instinctively took a step back. Mr. Hargrove, the man said, his voice flat. Richard's pulse quickened. The words hung in the air. The man wasn't just familiar. He was familiar in the wrong way. The realization hit Richard like a truck. This man was one of the figures he had seen in the abyss. One of the lost. A flicker of recognition, a flash of memories, came rushing back. But they weren't his memories. They were other people's. His breath quickened as the figure stepped closer. I don't know you, Richard managed to say. His voice trembled. The man gave a slow, eerie smile, his eyes narrowing. Of course you don't. Not anymore. Richard's stomach twisted. His throat went dry. What do you mean? What do you want from me? He demanded, his voice rising with panic. The figure's expression remained unchanged. You're not the man you once were, Mr. Hargrove. You erased yourself. You gave it all away. But you're still here. Richard staggered back, his hand gripping the nearest railing to steady himself. No, I can't be. The figure chuckled softly, the sound unnervingly hollow. Oh, you are. But there's something missing. You signed the deal. You chose it. But now, you'll live with the consequences. Richard's chest constricted. He looked down at his hands, his body shaking. What are you talking about? You're still breathing, the man replied, his voice cold. But the world? He gestured broadly at the courthouse, the street beyond. It's moved on without you. You'll never get back what you lost. The life you had. It's been replaced. Richard's heart pounded. His mind scrambled. What do you mean, replaced? What? The world doesn't remember you, Mr. Hargrove. The figure interrupted, his voice turning sharp. Your wealth? Gone. Your power? Erased. Your name? The figure shook his head. It's like you never existed. Richard's blood ran cold. No, there must be some mistake. Richard cried, his hands balling into fists. I did everything. I signed. I gave up everything. The figure's smile deepened, as if he found the situation amusing. Did you think there would be no cost for that, Richard? No cost for erasing your entire existence. Richard's breathing became shallow, his chest tight. What am I supposed to do then? The man stepped closer. You live, but you live as a ghost. Nothing more. Nothing less. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry, his voice barely a whisper. Why? Why do you care? The figure's smile faded. Oh, I don't care. I'm just here to remind you. He looked at Richard with a mix of pity and malice. What happens when you decide to erase yourself and give up everything? You disappear. You become nothing. Richard stumbled backward, his legs feeling like jelly beneath him. The weight of the man's words crushed him. He tried to speak again, but his voice was gone. The man stepped aside, allowing Richard to see what lay ahead. Nothing. A blank space. An empty world where Richard Hargrove no longer existed. The world had continued without him. And now? He was just a forgotten shadow, standing on the edge of a life he could never return to. Richard stood there, staring at the world that was no longer his. It was over. There was nothing left. And as the figure turned away, disappearing into the shadows, Richard finally understood. The cost was too high, and now it was too late to undo. Richard's legs gave out. He collapsed onto the courthouse steps, the world spinning around him. His hands trembled as he gripped the cold stone beneath him. His heart felt like it was being squeezed from the inside, his chest constricted by a pressure that refused to let go. He stared at the empty street ahead, at the world that seemed so full, yet so distant from him now. People walked past, but none of them noticed him. They didn't see him. They didn't acknowledge him. He was no longer a part of their world, just a shadow drifting on the edges of a place he could no longer touch. The figure who had spoken to him was gone, but the weight of his words lingered. You're nothing now, Richard Hargrove. He had been so arrogant, so sure that money, power, and influence were everything, that they would always protect him, that they would always bring him back from the edge. But now, standing here in the midst of everything he had once ruled, Richard realized the truth. He was invisible. He had nothing. He looked down at his hands, willing them to move, to feel something, anything. That proved he was still real. But there was nothing. No spark of recognition. No warmth of life. He was a ghost, walking through a world that had forgotten him, that had erased him, that didn't even know he existed anymore. Richard's breath came in sharp gasps. His mind raced. He had made a deal. A choice. He had chosen to disappear, to give up everything. He had thought that would free him from the consequences of his past, that he could walk away from the wreckage he had caused. But instead, it had consumed him. He had erased himself, but he had never realized that in doing so, he would be swallowed up by the void of his own actions. There was no escape, no redemption, nothing left. The people he had wronged, the families, the businesses, would never know what happened to him. They would never see the wreckage of the man who had ruined their lives, who had destroyed their futures. And maybe that was the worst part. He had taken so much, and now there was no one left to witness his fall. The world kept moving forward without him, and he would be left to drift, forgotten, never again to make an impact on anyone or anything. A soft breeze blew through the street, lifting a piece of paper from the ground and carrying it past him. Richard's eyes followed it for a moment, and something inside him shifted. He wanted to scream, to run after it, but there was no point. He could barely bring himself to move at all. His vision blurred as he slowly stood, unsteady on his feet. The street around him seemed to stretch farther and farther away, like he was disappearing into it. And then, he saw something. A small figure, standing across the street, staring directly at him. Richard blinked. His heart skipped a beat. The figure was too far to make out clearly, but it was unmistakably familiar. The way the figure stood, the posture, his throat constricted. The man, the one who had spoken to him, the one who had made him sign that damn contract. But this time, the man wasn't alone. He was accompanied by others, figures standing in the shadows, watching him from the edges of the street. Faces that were familiar and yet not. Richard's breath caught. His stomach twisted. He wanted to run, but his body wouldn't obey. The man across the street smiled. Richard felt it like a punch to the gut. That smile was the same as before. Cold. Unfeeling. You should have known, Richard, the man called, his voice cutting through the stillness of the street. You thought you could escape. Thought you could disappear. But nothing can erase what's inside you. Richard's head swam, his vision flickering. He was still disoriented, still reeling from everything he had just experienced. But the words struck him like a dagger to the heart. What's inside you? Richard repeated, barely able to breathe. The man's smile deepened. It's the truth, Richard. You can't outrun it. You can't hide from it. And you can't escape it. Richard's pulse throbbed in his ears. The world around him seemed to constrict, like he was suffocating. What are you talking about? His voice cracked, filled with desperation. The figure shook his head slowly, the smile never leaving his face. You think this world didn't notice you? You think the damage you caused didn't leave a mark? The people you destroyed? They're still here, Richard. And now, so are you. Richard's chest tightened. No. I gave everything away. I signed it. The figure stepped forward, and the shadows behind him stirred, closing in around Richard. You can't escape what you've done, the man whispered. You can't erase the past. The shadows around Richard grew heavier, thicker, suffocating. The figures behind the man were closing in, their hollow eyes staring, accusing. No, Richard breathed, his voice barely a whisper. He felt their presence behind him. All the people he had wronged, all the victims, all the lives he had shattered. He felt them closing in, their weight on his chest, their disappointment and anger radiating through the air. He had tried to erase himself, to run from the consequences. But it was clear now. There was no running. There was no escape. The world had moved on without him, but the damage he had caused remained, and it would never let him go. As the darkness wrapped around him, Richard finally understood. The contract, the decision, everything had been a lie. There was no erasure, no freedom. There was only accountability. And now, he would face it. Forever. Richard's knees buckled beneath him. He sank to the ground, the cold pavement pressing against his skin. The weight of everything. The crushing realization that there was no escaping, no undoing what had been done, threatened to suffocate him. The figures around him closed in, their eyes hollow and unblinking. The shadows wrapped tighter, pulling him further into the abyss, the weight of his past weighing down on him like an anchor. You thought you could buy your way out of this. The man's voice cut through the suffocating silence, calm, steady, but piercing. But money doesn't erase what's inside. What's been done? Richard gasped for breath, his hands pressing against his temples as the memories flooded back. The people he had deceived, manipulated, destroyed. The countless lives he had shattered for the sake of profit, for the sake of his own greed. He had made them all disappear in his mind, hadn't he? He had convinced himself that as long as he kept his empire running, nothing else mattered. But now the world had moved on without him, and he was nothing more than a forgotten ghost, living in the wake of his own destruction. His voice was a hoarse whisper. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. His words faltered. The guilt, the weight of the truth, felt like it was crushing his chest. The man who had spoken to him earlier stepped forward, his silhouette clear in the dim light. You didn't mean to? That's what all the cowards say. But you did. You made a choice, Richard. A choice to hurt others for your own gain. The figures around him stepped closer, their eyes burning with the remnants of the lives Richard had destroyed. And now it's time to pay. The man gestured to them, and they stepped back, allowing Richard a moment to breathe, if only for a brief second. He stared down at his hands, as if the answers could be found there. What had he really lost? He had erased himself. He had given up everything. But now, as he faced the consequences of his actions, it became clear he had never truly been able to escape. The world had forgotten him, but the people he had wronged hadn't. The past he had buried so deeply in the hope that it would never rise again was now back, stronger than ever. And it wouldn't let him go. The figures surrounding him, the ones who had once been part of his world, stepped into the darkness, melding with it, becoming part of the same endless void that had tried to consume him before. But they weren't gone. They were always there, inside him, in the depths of his memories. Richard stood slowly, shaky but determined. He turned his gaze to the man who had spoken to him. No, who had led him here. What do you want from me? Richard's voice was barely audible, filled with exhaustion. His body felt hollow, worn out by the endless struggle. What am I supposed to do now? The figure studied him for a moment, and then he smiled, though the expression was not one of kindness. It was a knowing smile, like the smile of someone who had already seen the end before it came. "You'll never truly understand the cost of what you've done," the man replied. "But maybe that's the point." He paused. "You don't get to choose the price." Richard's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening. "What does that mean?" he demanded. The man simply shook his head. "It means this is just the beginning, Richard." Before Richard could react, the man was gone, and the figures that had been surrounding him melted back into the shadows, leaving him alone. The world around him felt suddenly hollow, the streets stretching out into the distance like a vast, empty void. For a long moment, Richard stood there, feeling nothing. And then, he took a step, one slow step forward. The pain, the fear, the guilt, it didn't leave him. It never would. But now, he realized he couldn't stand still anymore. He couldn't stay in this void, drowning in the past he had created. He had made the choice to erase himself. And in doing so, he had made his past disappear, but only from the world's eyes. The truth still remained inside him. And as long as he was alive, that truth would never fade. And yet, somewhere deep within him, there was still a faint flicker of hope. A part of him that was still human, still able to feel something, even if it was pain. He had made a terrible mistake. But now he had to face it. One step at a time. No more running. No more hiding. The consequences of his actions had come to collect. They would always be with him, inescapable and unforgiving. But now, Richard knew there was no way forward except through the pain. He would carry it with him, as he had carried his greed and arrogance. But he had to keep moving. Even if the road ahead was shrouded in darkness, even if he could never escape the past, he had to live with it. And that was the price he would pay. Richard's steps were slow, each one heavier than the last, as though the weight of the world pressed against his chest, making it harder to breathe. The air around him felt thick, suffocating. Every step he took, every inch of movement, seemed to be a struggle against something deep inside himself, something he couldn't outrun. He had thought he could escape the past. He had believed that by erasing his name, his wealth, and his identity, he could somehow rid himself of the guilt and the pain. But it was clear now, there was no escaping what he had done, no way to undo the damage he had caused. The world continued to turn, oblivious to the man who had once ruled it with an iron fist. People moved around him, their lives unfolding as if he had never existed. But in the quiet of his mind, Richard could hear the echoes of those he had wronged. Their voices still lingered, even if no one else could hear them. As he walked down the street, aimlessly, his eyes were drawn to a small newsstand. A headline caught his attention. It was a business article, something he would have normally skimmed, maybe even read with a sense of ownership, before he had disappeared. Now, though, it struck him in a way it never had before. The headline read, "New entrepreneur takes over the industry, the rise of a new leader." Richard felt his stomach churn. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about anything he had built. This was the world moving on, without him. The company he had started, the empire he had built, the legacy he had left behind, it was gone. And in its place, someone else had filled the void, someone who would take it all and reshape it into something new. Richard stood there, staring at the paper. His fingers twitched, as though he might reach out to take it. But then, he stopped. What would be the point? He wasn't part of that world anymore. And the longer he lingered in the shadows of that reality, the more distant it seemed. He had given it up. It was time to move forward. But where? His mind raced as he walked. What was left for him? He had no name, no identity, no wealth, and no connection to the world that once bowed before him. He was a nobody, nothing but a faded memory of a man who had once believed he could have it all. But was there still something left inside him? Was there a way to make amends? To face those he had wronged? He didn't know. But the answer, if it existed, was somewhere out there. In the empty streets, in the faces of strangers who would never recognize him. And so, with nothing left to his name, Richard took another step. A step into the unknown. The world was vast. It was full of possibilities. He had built empires on the backs of others, but now he would have to rebuild himself, if that was even possible. He had no illusion that things could go back to the way they were, but maybe, just maybe, he could carve out a new existence. One that was not defined by what he had taken, but by what he could give. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Richard felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope, not for his past or for what he had lost, but for what he could still become. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty streets, Richard Hargrove walked into the night, his future uncertain, but his journey, finally, beginning.